By the early 1960s, the world was trapped in a tense and dangerous rivalry known as the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were competing for global influence, and every conflict around the world was viewed through the lens of ideology. To American leaders, the spread of communism was not just a regional issue, it was a direct threat to global stability and U.S. power. Nowhere did this fear feel more urgent than in Southeast Asia. After the division of Vietnam, the country became split between two opposing governments. North Vietnam, led by communist leadership, was supported by allies such as the Soviet Union and China. South Vietnam, backed by the United States, struggled to maintain stability while facing growing insurgency from communist guerrilla forces known as the Viet Cong. American officials feared that if South Vietnam fell, neighboring countries would follow. This belief became known as the domino theory, the idea that one nation turning communist could trigger a chain reaction across Asia. To U.S. policymakers, Vietnam was no longer just a local conflict. It had become a frontline in the global battle against communism. At first, American involvement remained limited. The United States provided military advisors, funding and equipment to support South Vietnam. But as violence escalated, the situation rapidly deteriorated. Guerrilla attacks increased across the countryside. Villages became battlegrounds. The Viet Cong used ambush tactics, hidden tunnels and local support networks to strike quickly before disappearing into dense jungles. Traditional military strategies struggled against this kind of warfare. Unlike conventional armies, the enemy often blended into civilian populations, making it difficult to distinguish fighters from ordinary villagers. Frustration grew among American military leaders who believed stronger action was necessary to stop the spread of communism before the situation spiraled out of control. Then came a turning point. In August 1964, reports emerged of attacks involving U.S. naval forces in the Gulf of Tonkin near the coast of North Vietnam. According to official accounts, American destroyers had been targeted by North Vietnamese patrol boats. The incident shocked Washington and intensified calls for military escalation. Although controversy later surrounded parts of the event, the immediate political impact was enormous. The U.S. government responded quickly. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving the president broad authority to expand military operations in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. This decision dramatically increased American involvement in the conflict. Inside Washington, military strategists began debating how to force North Vietnam to stop supporting the insurgency in the South. Many officials believed that overwhelming air power could achieve what ground operations could not. The United States possessed one of the most advanced air forces in the world, and planners believed sustained bombing would cripple enemy infrastructure, destroy supply routes, and pressure North Vietnamese leadership into negotiation or surrender. The strategy seemed straightforward. Bomb the enemy hard enough, long enough, and resistance would collapse. Supporters of the plan argued that modern air power could break morale and demonstrate American military superiority without requiring a massive ground invasion of North Vietnam itself. They believed the enemy would realize continued resistance was impossible against such overwhelming force. But others warned that the situation was more complicated. North Vietnam had already endured years of war and hardship. Its leadership appeared deeply committed to reunifying the country, regardless of the cost. Critics feared that bombing alone might strengthen resistance instead of weakening it. Despite these concerns, momentum toward escalation continued. By 1965, the United States officially launched a massive and sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. Its name was Operation Rolling Thunder. The operation was designed as a calculated display of power. American aircraft would target bridges, railways, fuel depots, military facilities, and supply networks across North Vietnam. The goal was not only military destruction but psychological pressure. U.S. leaders hoped the campaign would force North Vietnam to reconsider its support for the war in the South. At first, many officials believed the operation would last only a short time. Few imagined it would continue for years. As aircraft carriers moved into position and fighter jets prepared for combat missions, confidence remained high within much of the American military establishment. The United States possessed superior technology, greater resources, and overwhelming firepower. But Vietnam was not a conventional battlefield. Dense jungles, determined resistance, and guerrilla tactics would soon challenge assumptions about what military power alone could accomplish. What began as a strategic bombing campaign would evolve into one of the most controversial military operations of the Vietnam War. And as the bombs began to fall, the conflict itself would grow larger, deadlier, and far more complicated than anyone expected. In March 1965, the skies over Vietnam erupted with the sound of American fighter jets. After months of rising tension and political debate, the United States officially began Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign unlike anything North Vietnam had faced before. The first air strikes were intended as a warning. American military planners believed that carefully selected attacks on strategic targets would pressure North Vietnam into reducing support for communist forces operating in the South. The operation was designed not only to destroy infrastructure, but to send a message. The United States was prepared to use overwhelming force if necessary. At the beginning, many officials expected quick results. The United States possessed enormous technological and military advantages. Modern fighter aircraft, long-range bombers, naval aviation, and precision strike capabilities gave American forces unmatched air superiority. Military leaders believed sustained bombing could cripple North Vietnam's ability to continue the war. Aircraft carriers positioned in the Gulf of Tonkin became floating launch platforms for continuous combat missions. Day after day, American pilots launched into dangerous airspace, carrying bombs, rockets, and heavy ammunition toward targets deep inside North Vietnam. The scale of the operation expanded rapidly. Hundreds of sorties were flown each week. Bridges, railways, fuel storage facilities, military bases, factories, and transportation networks became primary targets. Strategic planners hoped that destroying supply lines would weaken the enemy's ability to move weapons and troops into South Vietnam. Massive explosions shook roads and industrial zones across the country. From the air, American pilots could see smoke rising from damaged infrastructure while anti-aircraft fire lit up the skies below. Bomb craters scarred roads and farmland as the campaign intensified month after month. But Vietnam presented challenges unlike any previous battlefield. Dense jungles covered large portions of the landscape, providing natural concealment for enemy forces and supply routes. North Vietnamese troops became highly skilled at camouflage, hiding equipment beneath forest cover and quickly repairing damaged roads after attacks. Supplies often moved at night or through hidden jungle paths that were difficult to detect from the air. One route became especially important, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Stretching through jungles and neighboring territories, this vast network of roads and pathways allowed North Vietnam to move troops and supplies southward despite constant bombing attempts. Even when parts of the trail were destroyed, repairs often began almost immediately. At the same time, North Vietnam strengthened its defenses. With support from communist allies, the country developed one of the most heavily defended airspaces in the world. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned around key locations, creating deadly barriers for incoming aircraft. Soviet-made surface-to-air missile systems added a new and dangerous threat to American pilots. The skies became increasingly lethal. Pilots flying bombing missions faced constant danger from missiles, heavy gunfire, and enemy fighter aircraft. Many missions required aircraft to fly through intense defensive fire while navigating difficult weather and terrain conditions. Some pilots never returned. As losses increased, stories of captured American airmen began reaching the public. Pilots shot down over North Vietnam were taken prisoner, adding another emotional dimension to the growing conflict. Families back home waited anxiously for news while the war expanded further. Despite the destruction caused by the bombing campaign, North Vietnamese resistance showed little sign of collapse. Instead of surrendering, enemy forces adapted. Bridges destroyed during the day were repaired at night. Supplies were rerouted through hidden paths. Underground tunnels and bunkers protected troops and equipment from aerial attacks. Entire systems of concealment and rapid reconstruction emerged in response to the bombardment. This adaptability frustrated American military planners. Operation Rolling Thunder had been designed as both a military and psychological campaign. Continuous bombing was supposed to weaken morale and pressure North Vietnamese leadership into negotiation. But the strategy produced mixed results. Rather than breaking resistance, many civilians and soldiers became more determined to continue fighting. Meanwhile, the bombing campaign itself kept growing. More aircraft were deployed. More targets were added. Restrictions on certain areas slowly loosened as pressure mounted to increase military effectiveness. The operation that had originally been envisioned as limited and controlled gradually expanded into a massive years-long campaign. Back in the United States, officials continued debating strategy. Some military leaders argued the bombing was too restricted and should become even more aggressive. Others warned that escalation risked drawing larger communist powers deeper into the conflict. The war was becoming increasingly difficult to manage politically as well as militarily. But in the skies above Vietnam, the missions continued. American jets roared across jungles, rivers, and cities carrying out strikes day after day. Pilots faced danger with every mission, while civilians below endured the constant threat of explosions and destruction. What had begun as a calculated show of force was evolving into something far larger and far more complicated. And despite the immense firepower unleashed during Operation Rolling Thunder, one reality was becoming impossible to ignore. North Vietnam was still fighting. As Operation Rolling Thunder intensified, the destruction across Vietnam became impossible to ignore. What had started as a strategic bombing campaign aimed at military infrastructure was now affecting entire regions of the country. Explosions echoed across jungles, villages, railways, and industrial zones as American aircraft carried out continuous strikes day after day. For civilians living beneath the bombing routes, fear became part of everyday life. Villages near supply lines and strategic targets often found themselves caught in the middle of the conflict. Homes were destroyed. Roads and bridges collapsed under repeated attacks. Families fled damaged areas searching for safety while smoke and fire spread across the countryside. The landscape itself began to change. Massive bomb craters scarred farmland and forests. Dense jungle areas were torn apart by explosives, leaving behind burned vegetation and shattered terrain. Entire regions carried visible signs of the war as the campaign continued year after year. Yet despite the overwhelming firepower unleashed by the United States, North Vietnam refused to collapse. Instead, resistance adapted and evolved. One of the greatest frustrations for American military planners was the enemy's ability to recover quickly after attacks. Roads destroyed by bombing were often repaired within days, or sometimes within hours. Bridges were rebuilt using temporary structures. Supplies continued moving through hidden jungle routes and underground systems designed specifically to survive aerial bombardment. The Ho Chi Minh Trail remained especially difficult to stop. Stretching across dense terrain through neighboring territories, the trail functioned as a massive logistical network supporting communist forces in the south. Even under relentless bombing, North Vietnamese forces continued finding ways to move weapons, ammunition, and troops through concealed pathways protected by jungle cover and camouflage. American commanders had expected the bombing campaign to weaken enemy morale and reduce resistance. Instead, many reports suggested the opposite was happening. Rather than surrendering under pressure, North Vietnamese leadership appeared even more determined to continue the war. Civilians and soldiers adapted to constant danger, building underground shelters and survival systems designed to endure continuous attacks from the air. This resilience shocked many officials in Washington. Operation Rolling Thunder had been based on the belief that overwhelming air power could force political change. But the conflict was proving far more complicated than military planners had anticipated. Technology and firepower alone were not delivering the expected results. Inside the American military, frustration grew steadily. Pilots risked their lives on dangerous missions, yet enemy supply networks continued functioning. Aircraft losses increased as North Vietnamese air defenses improved. Surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft guns turned many bombing runs into deadly encounters. Some American pilots described flying through walls of fire while attempting to reach heavily defended targets. Every mission carried enormous risks. Some aircraft were destroyed instantly by missile strikes. Others returned badly damaged after surviving intense defensive fire. Pilots captured after being shot down faced years as prisoners of war, becoming powerful symbols of the growing human cost of the conflict. Meanwhile, the war itself was entering American homes through television screens. For the first time in modern history, graphic footage from the battlefield reached the public on a regular basis. Viewers watched scenes of burning villages, wounded civilians, damaged cities, and exhausted soldiers. Images of destruction began changing public perception of the war. Support for the conflict slowly began to weaken. Across the United States, anti-war protests started growing larger. University campuses became centers of political activism as students questioned the purpose and morality of the bombing campaign. Demonstrators marched through major cities demanding an end to escalation in Vietnam. Critics argued that Operation Rolling Thunder was causing enormous destruction without achieving clear strategic success. Others questioned whether bombing civilian areas and infrastructure could ever truly win a war built around guerrilla resistance and political ideology. The longer the campaign continued, the more divided public opinion became. International criticism also increased. Many foreign governments and humanitarian observers expressed concern about civilian casualties and the widening scale of destruction. The Vietnam War was no longer viewed simply as a regional conflict. It had become one of the most controversial global issues of the era. Inside Washington, political pressure mounted. Military leaders requested expanded bombing authority and fewer restrictions on targets. Some believed the campaign had failed because it was too limited. Others warned that further escalation risked provoking larger communist powers such as China or the Soviet Union into direct confrontation. The strategy itself became deeply controversial. Could bombing force a determined enemy into surrender? Was the destruction creating more resistance instead of less? And how long could the United States continue escalating a war with no clear end in sight? By the late 1960s, Operation Rolling Thunder had transformed from a military operation into something much larger, a symbol of a war growing increasingly difficult to control. The bombing campaign continued pouring immense firepower into Vietnam, yet victory. By 1968, after years of relentless bombing, Operation Rolling Thunder was reaching a turning point. What had once been presented as a decisive strategy to pressure North Vietnam into surrender had instead become a long and exhausting campaign with uncertain results. The United States had deployed enormous military power across Vietnam. Thousands of bombing missions had been carried out. Vast amounts of explosives had been dropped across roads, bridges, factories, railways, fuel depots, and supply routes. Entire regions bore the scars of continuous aerial warfare. Yet despite the scale of destruction, North Vietnam continued fighting. Inside Washington, confidence in the strategy was fading. Military leaders and political officials were forced to confront a difficult reality. Air power alone was not achieving the objectives originally promised. The bombing campaign had damaged infrastructure and caused severe disruption, but it had failed to break the enemy's will or stop support flowing into South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive in early 1968 intensified these concerns even further. Although communist forces suffered heavy losses during the offensive, the scale and coordination of the attacks shocked the American public and military leadership. For many observers, the offensive demonstrated that despite years of bombing and escalating military involvement, the war was far from under control. Public support for the conflict continued collapsing. Anti-war demonstrations grew larger across the United States. Protesters questioned why the bombing campaign continued despite mounting casualties and no clear path to victory. Television coverage of the war had transformed public perception, exposing the human cost of the conflict in ways previous wars had rarely shown. Political pressure increased rapidly. Government officials faced growing criticism from journalists, activists, students, and even some military analysts. Questions that once seemed unpatriotic were now openly debated. Had Operation Rolling Thunder failed? Was the destruction worth the cost? Could the war even be won through military escalation? Eventually, American leadership decided to change direction. In 1968, the United States officially halted Operation Rolling Thunder. After more than 3 years of sustained bombing, one of the largest aerial campaigns in modern warfare came to an end. But the war itself did not end. Fighting in Vietnam continued, and American involvement remained deeply controversial for years afterward. The conclusion of Rolling Thunder marked not a victory, but a strategic reassessment. A recognition that the bombing campaign had not achieved the political and military breakthrough many leaders had expected. The costs of the operation were immense. Thousands of civilians and soldiers lost their lives during the years of bombardment. Entire communities were displaced by destruction and constant fear of airstrikes. The environmental damage left lasting scars across parts of Vietnam, where bomb craters and ruined infrastructure remained visible long after the campaign ended. American forces also paid a heavy price. Numerous aircraft were lost during missions over heavily defended territory. Pilots endured some of the most dangerous combat conditions of the war, facing anti-aircraft fire, missile systems, and capture if shot down. Many veterans carried physical and psychological trauma long after returning home. Beyond the battlefield, Operation Rolling Thunder left a deep impact on military strategy itself. For decades, many military planners had believed overwhelming air power could force enemies into submission. But Vietnam challenged this assumption. The campaign demonstrated that technological superiority and massive firepower did not automatically guarantee political success against a determined and adaptable enemy. Historians and military analysts continue debating the operation today. Some argue the campaign was too limited and restricted to achieve decisive results. Others believe the strategy itself was fundamentally flawed from the beginning, relying too heavily on bombing to solve a conflict rooted in politics, ideology, and guerrilla warfare. The operation also became a symbol of Cold War escalation. What began as an attempt to contain communism gradually evolved into one of the most controversial military campaigns in American history. The war divided public opinion, reshaped political debate, and changed how future generations viewed military intervention abroad. For Vietnam, the legacy was even more personal. Communities rebuilt among ruins left by years of conflict. Survivors carried memories of explosions, displacement, and destruction that would remain for decades. The war altered landscapes, families, and lives on both sides of the conflict. Even today, the name Operation Rolling Thunder represents more than just a bombing campaign. It stands as a reminder of the limits of military power in modern warfare. A reminder that overwhelming force does not always produce surrender. And a reminder that wars driven by ideology and resistance are often far more complex than leaders expect when conflicts first begin. The campaign had been designed to force victory from the skies. Instead, it revealed how endurance, adaptation, and political reality could withstand even the most powerful military machine on Earth. And in the end, despite years of bombing and destruction, Vietnam was still fighting.